Welcome back, everyone, to a brand new episode of the Crypto and Muay Thai podcast. I'm very excited to welcome the special guest today, Florian Liss. He is the co-founder of Staking Facilities based in Germany. I am super excited to talk to him. He's got tons of information at one of the most burgeoning spaces within crypto or digital assets right now, which is obviously staking. For those of you that don't know, don't worry, we're going to cover it. But without further ado, Florian, how are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing fine. Thank you for having me. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. No complaints. It's a pleasure
Great.
to have you. So for those that might be listening that are unfamiliar with yourself or staking facilities, why don't you give like a 2-minute bio or background on yourself, and then we'll use that as a natural launching point to talk about staking facilities as well.
Sure. So my name is Florian. I'm based in Munich, Germany, and I basically work as a technical lead at Staking Facilities. So what that means is we run infrastructure for proof-of-stake networks in, for example, Cosmos, Tezos, Polkadot. And yeah, I came into crypto like in 2016, early 2017, by writing smart contracts at university for a program where we basically looked into how could a government use crypto to ease their processes. And so I quickly realized that if you don't look at crypto like a usual business, but more like a space where you benefit from all the things going on with other people. And so that's where like my first like aha moment came from, was like, oh yeah, this should like, it helps people working together. And then from there, I met my two co-founders, Wolfgang and Julius, through a common friend. And like we clicked instantly because we had this mutual topic like crypto. And then we started talking, okay, we want to go professional in the space, and how can we basically add value to the space with our knowledge, our skill set. And yeah, we quickly we started with investments, and like we looked at the space and talked about how will it look like in a few years. And for us, it was pretty clear that proof of work is one of the pain points that we always had that like prevents scalability from really hitting off. Yeah, and so we said like, okay, we need to do something with proof of stake. And being a staking provider, being an infrastructure provider with a great location, like we're based directly in the middle of Europe, basically, was for us, yeah, it was a great start. And so we said like, okay, let's do this. And yeah, a few years later, now we are as Staking Facilities.
Got you. So you said two things in there that let's just touch on very quickly, just in case there's some listeners that have maybe a sort of more elementary understanding. So you're talking about proof of work versus proof of stake. Obviously, you guys focus specifically within proof of stake. So let's talk about the difference between proof of stake versus proof of work very quickly, like super at a high level, and then use that to segue into what is staking, like what is the staking function within the proof of stake networks or protocols.
Yeah. So first of all, like if we look at like proof of work, that's what Bitcoin and Ethereum right now is using. It's the so-called Nakamoto consensus we're using there, which basically means we have a blockchain, and we always say the state of the longest blockchain we can see is true. So that's the chain we are following. And how do we append blocks to the chain is by doing proof of work. So we are having huge GPU miners that try to solve a puzzle or find a certain hash and like find a new block. And if you look at Bitcoin, I don't know which country it's compared to right now, but it always is. I think the last time I looked at it was like Denmark or something like that, where the energy consumption of Bitcoin is like incredibly high and comparable to a country. And so if you look at that, it's obvious that this is hard to scale, and also it's pretty hard for decentralization because you have different electricity costs, and if you're in a location where electricity is cheap, you will probably centralize your mining farms around there. And so countries where electricity is expensive will probably not contribute that much to that. And so if you look at proof of stake in comparison, sorry, there's another entry mechanism. So I would also always like call this the entry mechanism. In proof of work, the entry mechanism to do this consensus is providing the work. In proof of stake, you provide stake as an entry mechanism, which means it's basically you put down a self bond and you say what I'm saying is true, and if it's true, I'll get rewarded when I mine a block. And if I lie about something, like I didn't verify the transactions are valid in my block, or I said like 2 blocks at the same height exist, then I can get my stake slashed, which means I get taken away a part of it or all of it. So that's the entry mechanism for proof of stake. And then in the background, you have a consensus, which can be just like something very old and traditional, like round robin, where people just agree, like everyone signs the same message. Or you can have something like much newer, like for example, proof of history, like Solana uses, which is then basically the consensus around proof of stake.
Gotcha. Okay, so now that we have a good understanding, or potentially a little bit more in depth, versus the difference between proof of work, which is essentially the Genesis algorithm that you're talking that Nakamoto built, or sort of gave to the world in and of itself. But over these past few years, given the scalability issues, you're seeing more and more of this movement towards proof of stake, which probably the most high profile one is Ethereum moving from their 1.0 version, which was proof of work, to their 2.0 version, which is proof of stake. We'll touch into that a little bit later, because I believe Staking Facilities is going to offer staking around that. So we'll definitely circle back to that. But let's touch back into Staking Facilities a little bit in sort of like the Genesis, or the Genesis phase. So you're at university working on projects, you met your co-founders, you're looking at the space conceptually and saying everything that you sort of talked about. Proof of work has a bottleneck. It seems the space is moving more towards proof of stake, given that can remove said bottleneck and grow its scalability. How do you guys dive in initially? Where do you look for as your initial area that you're thinking about making a beachhead, so to speak? So you're talking about infrastructure, but there's plenty of ways to get involved with proof of stake. So walk us through sort of like that discovery process, or business discovery process that you guys ultimately decided upon, and then move forward through Staking Facilities, including any iterations or pivots that you guys may have experienced in some of the earlier days.
Sure. So as I said in the beginning, we were all just like from university or very young, and like we started investing with our own money, with our own crypto. And like the first thing we realized is that there's actually not that many people actually reading white papers and understanding what's going on there and what's the timeline, if it's realistic or not. And so we started there, and like just first of all figuring out what projects are we into, what do we like, what do we think has value in the future. And so from there, we first thought like maybe we should do consulting, like give our knowledge to other people and just tell people what to do, or which projects are interesting. And this could be like financial consulting, but also like consulting developers which chain they should build on. But like we quickly realized that we want to do something on chain. So we want to be part of that ecosystem and not just like on the edge and just like bring other people in. So we want to build something where people say that's cool. And then like we looked at it and we said like, okay, I mean, if we're betting on proof of stake and we're putting our own money down, we quickly realized that in proof of stake, if you don't stake your money, like if you don't stake your own tokens, you will be diluted, because you have an inflation on chain, which is basically paid out by block rewards. And if everyone stakes, but you're not, and they get rewards and you're not, you're basically losing part of your investment. And so we said like, okay, that's very interesting. Like people are not forced, I wouldn't say forced, but incentivized to stake. So basically your customers are coming naturally if you do staking, if you offer staking. And so we said like, this is a very interesting business model to start with. And it brings you very close to all the developers, the team members of those projects. You can like get into all those different areas. I mean, as a validator, you're in governance, you're in security, you're basically in everything like token economics. And so we said like, this is really interesting. It looks like a lot of fun for us to do this. It looks like our skill set is ready to do this. So for example, if you're talking about governance, Julius, my co-founder, he studied political science, and he actually was thinking about like a career in politics. Like he was like involved in the EU and stuff like that in Brussels. So we said like, this fits us really well, and it gives us more knowledge. So if we ever want to do something else in the space, we have enough knowledge to consult, to develop, to do whatever we want to. And that's how the idea basically started.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly fascinating. And again, it's one of those things that I've talked about on several podcasts with several other crypto guests, is the digital asset space or blockchain technology in and of itself. It's like 21 flavors of ice cream. There's something for everyone. Yeah. And no matter where your background is coming from, you can find your particular area of interest or experience that you already have, whether it be through university work or through, real world job experience, and you can concentrate there. And again, I think that's what's so exciting about the space, but also specifically within proof of stake, for all the elements that you're talking about it, I find that this space is incredibly interesting. Reasons beyond the fact that the top staking coins are going through the roof right now. So we're having this conversation probably at the tail end of alt season, and we're seeing proof of stake coins really take off. So more and more hype or emphasis around proof of stake is gradually attracting more and more to the space, and presumably that will continue to happen as ETH 2.0 in theory executes on its 2020 roadmap of being able to kick off the initial versions, which is definitely early to be seen. So, okay, you've got your initial plan. You saw these things like, yes, let's get involved in this area. What's the initial coin or network that you guys decided to focus on with staking, and how did you make that choice?
So I think the choice came from Wolfgang. He's basically our, I would say, visionary. He always has a great view on the space in total. And so he came around, he said like, hey, Cosmos said they're gonna launch their blockchain soon. And like in reality, it took way longer than we thought, but we were like, okay, now we have like half a year to prepare, to set everything up, and it's gonna be awesome. So that's where we started, because we invested in the early ICO of Cosmos, and we said like, we have the tokens. We think the Cosmos white paper is one of the coolest to read, in my opinion, because it's very easy to read and you understand very quickly what it's about. And now, right now, it's interesting to go back, because right now Cosmos is starting to get started with like inter-blockchain communication and pushing all of this live. So it's really interesting to see this white paper come to life. And so, yeah, we started with Cosmos, but it turned out like we spent more than a year in testnets doing Cosmos. So it got really frustrating, because there's like literally like, you know everything about the software. Like I read every line of code of the software at one point. You tried to hack it, you tried everything, and it like, you just wanted to get it live and see if your business works, right? So it didn't come along right away. And so another project came on right away, which was Tezos. And what we saw in Tezos was, for us, it was really interesting that there weren't in the beginning that many validators. Like it wasn't just available, like people needed more, and especially like in Tezos, the validator has to put up a self bond. So like for like, it's around, I think, 10% of the tokens you have to hold yourself. So it's not like everyone can do it. You have to have the tokens to do it. And so we said like, okay, we got some tokens, like one of us participated in the ICO, we have enough to start off. And this is just for us, it's just like a proof that what we're working on right now works and that we know what we're doing. So I think Wolfgang just posted in our Telegram channel that now it's like 733 days of running our Tezos validator without any issues, like payments were always on point, and that's something that makes me really proud, but it also shows that reputation gets you far if you just stick to what you know.
So you talked about two things there. Let's just start with the last thing that you just mentioned. Is that an issue that is common within staking providers? Some kind of error within the infrastructure, how they built to where rewards are not distributed within a timely manner, or maybe the incorrect amount, say it was promising a 12% reward and it only gave 9%. Are there common errors within that among stakers or infrastructure providers?
No, I wouldn't say so. So most proof of stake projects today, they like the protocol itself enforces those commission fees and that you get paid the right amount. So like, for example, in Cosmos, we never touch your rewards. Like it's all the protocol. We can't do anything with it. But in Tezos specifically, the validators are responsible for paying their customers. So it's not on-chain, it's off-chain. So it's based on trust. And so right now we saw that a lot of like bakers work together and build their own solutions over time, but it took time for them to build them. And so we just built one in-house, which we're using now for like 2 years. And yeah, so it's not, I wouldn't say it's a huge proof of stake issue. It's more like that's the way Tezos was built. And I think like it will change in the future. But for now, there's enough like control mechanisms, there's enough pages that let you check if the rewards you got are actually correct or not.
Gotcha. Even though that it's not necessarily, issues aren't endemic to the staking space, that's still really, really impressive, where it's 34 days, you said, without issue.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, like being able to like have something and there's no issues with it, especially since Tezos delegates to the validators to be able to offer that. So regardless, I think that is incredible, and also sort of speaks to some of the areas that you were talking about before of building up a reputation, because presumably as this space kind of grows, reputation, not just from, bells and whistles, so to speak, but making sure that there's as minimal headaches as possible, given there is a barrier to entry within digital assets in and of itself, but also within proof of stake as well.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at just Ethereum right now, what's going on with the whole like DeFi craze and like yield farming and all of that, I sometimes really have problems understanding what's going on there. Like if you're not following the space every day, it's so hard. And like I always imagine our customers who probably having like another job, like not in crypto, who just want to put down their investment and see it grow over time. It's so hard, and the only thing you basically can do if you're not like active yourself is basically trust people who have a good track record. And so I think it's very important for us to give our customers that trust.
I completely agree, and I think that's something that will outside of the technological abilities that you guys have, which will set staking facilities apart as you guys continue to move on your path. Obviously, I'm biased. I have you on the podcast, so I wouldn't talk shit to your face, or maybe I would. But one of the things
Please
that you talked about, one of the things you mentioned right there, to take sort of a brief detour, like yield farming, this whole essence of liquidity mining. Like, what's your take on that? I'm with you. I'm in the same boat where I find it very difficult to keep track with a lot of these things, given there's a sort of a new special of the day, so to speak, in terms of what is catching all the hype in people's eyes, and new mechanisms and incentive structures to be able to essentially game growth hacking, which is very interesting, but also it's rife with a lot of potential issues, with DeFi being one of those situations where we've seen time and time again. Personally, I don't have a technical background, so I can't validate this myself, but seeing anecdotally all the exploits that have happened on DeFi protocols, exchanges, things like that, but then also talking with technical people. Again, we're based in Pittsburgh, so going over to Carnegie Mellon, where I'm an alum, and talking to a lot of those people that work in the cyber lab, and them saying, I could easily shut this thing down with, you know, a little bit of X, a little bit of Y, and it would completely come crashing down. So what are your thoughts on that? Because I'm super interested. I tried to touch into it a little bit. I wrote a Forbes piece, again, probably with a little bit more of an aggressive title than I could have been, but essentially just talking around a premise that this exuberance around it may have been offering some subtle buying pressure to Bitcoin. And I absolutely got lit up on Twitter. Like, people are like, no, that's freaking stupid. This guy's an it's like, I didn't say that this was like a white paper gospel. I just was merely articulating a premise that people maybe weren't thinking about, and they just shit all over me. So what are your thoughts on this particular new craze, so to speak, just for a brief detour?
I think it's always the same. We had 2017, we had the ICO craze, then we had DAOs, now we have yield farming. I think the cool thing that we're seeing is like, there's still tokens from the ICOs, there's still ERC20 tokens, it's a standard right now. And like every other blockchain copies it in some way or another. DAOs still, like, those are the things where those governance tokens come out of right now. And we see like the whole DeFi space, it's just building upon layer on layer on layer. It's not that those old things go away, it's just that they mature to a point where we see what we can build with them. And what you're saying is like, very smart people say like, yeah, I could shut this down if I had like 100,000 maker tokens or something like that, right? That's usually like what they're saying. True, but I think what we have to realize is that we're still so early in all of this. We're in an experimental phase, and that's why rewards in crypto are that high, but also risks in crypto are that high. Like, if crypto was safe, there wouldn't be a chance for us to go like times 10 as a not like institutional investor. That's not how it works usually with investments. And so I would say, like, if you want to participate in those things, do it just with what you can afford to lose, and try to understand what you're doing there. Like, for example, with yield farming, I think it's super interesting, but stuff like, is my CDP or is my loan like getting liquidated if like Ether drops by 10%, and what are there, like, if Ether drops by 10%, what happens to DAI? What happens to all those other assets? Are they following? Like, is there a ripple effect? I would try to be aware of that. Like, I don't think that everyone needs to be an expert to participate, but if you're not an expert, just make sure that you're ready to lose the money, because it's crypto and there's risk involved.
100%. You mentioned essentially everything being built on layer upon layer of Ethereum right now, or at least conceptually. Do you think that that poses a risk in this very, very early stage? Because you're 100% correct. We're in maybe inning, well, you're European, so you don't give a shit about baseball references, but like, you know, we're in very early stages of just this industry, the space in and of itself. So do you think that there's a risk of them layer on additional complexity with each additional layer right now, given some would argue that even the base layer, so the layer one protocols, it's still highly experimental? So do you think that the complexity ultimately will come back and kind of rear its ugly head? And even if so, are we still early enough to where, like, if there's like some kind of collapse given the complexities and unforeseen risks, that it's not terribly detrimental based upon everything you said? Because we'll still learn, we'll still evolve, but also the people that should be participating should be the ones that understand that this is highly speculative.
I think it's a hard question. If you, for example, if you look at Multisig Parity hack, I don't know if you're familiar with that. So basically, Polkadot in 2017 did an ICO. collected, I think, over 200 million US dollar worth in Ether and stored it on Multisig wallets that Parity, the company itself, like developed the smart contracts for that. And plenty of people used it over time. And like, I think a few months later, someone accidentally, we don't know really, deleted a library on Ethereum that all those like multi-sig wallets depend on. And so like more than $200 million in assets were frozen and are not accessible by anyone. So that's the problem of composability. If everyone builds upon those libraries and like one of the base libraries is broken or can be broken, then there's a huge risk. So I would say it's very risky. But on the other hand, like you see all those like protocols, all those smart contracts live every day, and there's huge amounts of money in there. Like if you're able to abuse that, probably someone is. So you see those hacks with exchanges and stuff like that. But it makes me pretty confident that those are not happening on a daily basis, but maybe like every few months something big happens, which for me means that we're slowly maturing, and that doesn't mean that we don't have to go back and verify that all the things we did before are still valid and still secure. But it gives me personally a confidence that it's working out in the end.
Got you. So given some of the things that we talked about, is that one of the areas that gives you additional excitement for working with some of these additional proof of stake network protocols? So Tezos, you mentioned that was the one that has essentially been your flagship because Cosmos got delayed. And I actually really like Tezos. I think it's super interesting. I mean, I really like Chainlink as well. I just think it's, in terms of price, it's inviting some interesting dynamics there. But so with proof of stake and Tezos in particular, does that give you an additional excitability around some of these potential like Ethereum killers or other adjacent network protocols that can vie for some of that market share that is firmly dominated by Ethereum right now?
So I think it all depends upon the execution of proof of stake on Ethereum, because all those Ethereum killers have not killed Ethereum, and Ethereum is still where all the developers are, where all the financial products are listed on. And so I would say what I'm most excited about with all those things happening and proof of stake coming to Ethereum is basically the tokenization of staking. So right now, like if you want to stake, usually the process is I have an address, I lock some tokens up, I say this is my validator, and I get rewards for it. That's basically what it is. But I don't think like this is how staking will look like in 5 years or so. I think there will be some like derivatives built upon staking, which basically give you like an index fund, which gives you a huge variety of different proof of stake protocols and also validation companies or validators, simply said. And you can just get a token that represents a share in every one of them. And then you just like, you can sell it, you can trade it, it's not locked up. And basically it's abstracted away in a form and built upon like financial products that are way more interesting. And so like, we're talking to some people who are doing some cool stuff in there, like also like staking insurance. So if your validator gets slashed, you basically get paid by someone else via insurance. And I think there's so much going on there. I'm really excited to see how those financial products around staking will evolve.
It sounds really interesting. So what you mentioned, the indexation of different proof of stake tokens, essentially run by a centralized validator where you can just get access to XYZ token and it'll represent a share of all those additional proof of stake protocols, assuming they would get access to potentially the capital gains that's associated with that as well, and also the rewards that come from that. Is that an idea that you've heard being tossed around in circles that you're involved with in Europe and just in the space in general? Because I think that's something that sounds extremely interesting.
Absolutely. I know like that's not our idea. Like it's discussed between validators and between networks all the time. I think first I heard of it like in Cosmos actually. So the Cosmos people are always very, very smart and trying to to find ways to build products that aren't there any yet. So I know some people there, they actually have a staking derivatives working group. So it's like public calls where everyone can participate. If you're especially interested in financial products, go there, share your knowledge. And then like, I know that, for example, Solana and Cosmos and stuff like that are working together right now to actually build it. I don't know how far it is, but yeah, I mean, this is going to be reality in like the next year, I would say.
Oh, wow. I think, I mean, that has one of the abilities, I think, to not necessarily be like a game changer, but be a really, really interesting adaptation, but then also potentially be more palatable to some of the existing institutions within the space, not institutions in the current, like the traditional form of huge multi-billion-dollar allocators, but some of the bigger names within the space, whether it be Polychain or Pantera or stuff like that. I could see that as a very in-demand solution for something like that in general.
Yeah.
So I think that's really interesting. So since you kind of brought it up, where do you see, based upon some of the conversations that you've had again with some of the smartest people in the space, like Solana, Cosmos, but also yourself, where do you see the space evolving to? And do you think it is a good evolution, or it is something that is kind of like still unknown given the nascency of the space?
So, I mean, it always depends on the time frame, I would say. Like, crypto evolves so fast, and like, it's really hard to predict. Yeah.
Let's say 3 to 5 years, or you know what?
3 to 5 years. Yeah.
Let's say 3 years. Let's say 3 years. Do some
Okay.
specificity.
Yeah.
So let's just say the next 3 years.
Yeah. So okay, in the next 3 years, I would assume that we see a lot of the tokens that are currently in like the top 20 drop hard in value just because they're stale in development, they're not up to date anymore. I think there's going to be some change. I think that the space will professionalize a lot. So like no matter where you look, I think from investments to financial products to the way you interact with smart contracts, so user experience, I think all of that will improve a lot in the next 3 years. I guess, or I hope at least, that's my bet, that proof of stake will be accepted as a valid solution. Like, there's still many people who are very suspicious of how proof of stake works, and I have to give them, like, there's some flaws, and that's something I'm more afraid of in the next 3 years, is like the VC coins. We see all those VCs buying huge part of the initial like tokens getting to the market, like in Series A's and private seed rounds. And I think that's gonna be like dangerous. Like, you don't want a blockchain with like 50% owned by 3 companies. That's not working. So that's something where I see it getting risky, like in the token economic section. But overall, I'm just thinking this is more going to look like real websites and the internet. We see it like in the 2000s than it is right now.
Got you.
Are
there any other existential threats you think to essentially the viability of your business or of the proof of stake space beyond centralization of node operators or validators? So maybe the lack of some of the early or the more popular proof of stake protocols actually being able to initiate or drum up like demonstrable traction from a fundamental perspective, like solving real world issues versus what seems to be primarily driven by partnership announcements and, you know, price hike and stuff like that. So are those two things, or some of those things that I sort of mentioned, but also there are other areas outside of centralization of validators and nodes that you see as like an existential threat over the coming 3 years as well for the space?
I mean, I think the partnerships are good for the space, especially even if it's like with non-crypto companies. It's great if like companies look into crypto, even if they then like a year later decide that it's currently not for them. Just to dip like their toes into the water is good in my opinion. But I would never like use a marketing campaign as a huge indicator for price long term. Like, just because you're partnering with Microsoft doesn't mean that they're actually using it or that your token is more valuable. So I would be careful there. But I would say the biggest like danger for something like staking facilities is actually like regulatory issues. So we're in Germany, we're registered in Germany, so we actually have to be really careful about stuff like custodial solutions. Like, we're not allowed to touch your tokens. We would need like a banking license to do that. So that's why we always try to stay away from touching any of your tokens actually. And we think it's better that way because it should be built in a trustless way. You shouldn't have to trust us to steal your tokens or not to steal your tokens. But yeah, like regulatory stuff, it's like, it's really interesting. Like, we thought about it a lot. Like, if there's any other business model where you don't know your customers, you don't know where they're from, like which country they are from, which is like in regulatory thinking really complex. Like, I don't know if a delegation over $1 million I get to a Tezos baker comes from the US, comes from Germany, or comes from Saudi Arabia, or even North Korea. I just can't tell. Like, it's not on chain. There's no identity on chain. And so that makes it really hard for us to follow stuff like AML, so anti-money laundering. It's really hard because the German thing is so similar. So yeah, it makes us really hard to follow those things. And that's why we actually, we founded like a working group for proof of stake in the European Blockchain Association to basically suggest some things to the EU in regards to regulatory issues with proof of stake. Yeah.
Got you. How do you feel? So that's a threat that was not at the top of my mind, but obviously should be, given it is one of the top things that is in the space at all times, regardless of you're an allocator looking to get exposure, buy into the space, or whether you're an entrepreneur within the space building. The regulatory guidance in its current form, but also looking out again over the next 1, 2, 3 years, is incredibly murky. It's vague because I don't think anyone really knows because the space is so new. With that being said, do you feel that the culture, the climate in Europe is becoming more digital asset friendly, more blockchain friendly, maybe a little bit less so? I know Deribit, obviously, one of the largest options exchanges, centralized exchanges that was based in the Netherlands, relocated everyone, their entire LLC and their corporation to Panama, given they felt that they were coming under maybe some undue burden via EU regulatory bodies, or maybe it was specifically Dutch regulatory bodies. So is the culture, is the climate getting a little bit nicer, or maybe getting a little bit more tightened around some of the work that you guys are doing there?
So first of all, I would like to say, I don't think it's just because the space is so new that it's like hard to regulate. It's more like there's so many nuances between like networks and between stuff. Like, if you're like a policymaker, try to understand the difference between Bitcoin and Ethereum. Just like, you're not technical, you're not involved in the space, and you maybe get one day to look at it. It's just really hard to understand it. And then there are people coming like, oh, but what if I move my Bitcoin to Ethereum and then stake them on a layer 2 chain? And you're like, what are you talking about? I have no idea. So I think it's more that it's just a complex and space with huge variety. And then going to the question regarding the EU, I think it really depends where you are. But overall, from my perspective, I think like policymakers are really happy about input. They wanted to succeed. They just feel like threatened by it. Like, if you look at Libra, that's probably like the biggest conversation around the whole regulatory topic was started by the introduction of Libra. And I understand why governments are afraid of that, but I don't think like they're that much afraid of like public blockchains. Like, it's more like those huge institutions that are like Facebook, who have a lot of influence and power, and who basically can take away the reason for having a like national currency. Like they can take it away from you. They can probably, like, if you look at like poorer states, like for example Cambodia, where they have their own like currency, but everyone on the street pays with dollar, or like tourists pay with dollar because it's preferred. And now you have Facebook, and you could suddenly send like dollar everywhere in the world. Like those little countries would probably get would get issues with their own like currency. So I understand that they're afraid and they try to regulate it. I don't think they're hostile against it. It's just lack of knowledge, overwhelming like complexity, and I think it will just take time, and they will find a way to regulate correctly and fair. Yeah,
I think that's a fair perspective, and I tend to agree with pretty much everything you said. And you touched upon something that I think is important, because the particular tokens or the particular blockchain projects, for lack of a better word, that are really catching the eye of regulators are things that essentially threaten their monetary sovereignty. And Libra being the biggest case, just like you said, like instantly that had the ability to displace potentially the US dollar's homogeny, like within the world, being able to just send it anywhere. But if it was presenting threats to that, then I can imagine how some of the smaller countries with weaker fiat regimes would necessarily feel there. And again, that's kind of why 2020 has been the year of the stable coins, because of COVID related weakness, and the fact that you have something in theory in terms of tether that is backed 1-to-1 with US dollars that you can instantly buy and sell from your local depreciating currency down, you know, depending on what time of year it is, maybe 15 to 30% from the beginning of the year versus the US dollar. That's incredibly powerful. So I see regulators really looking at that first and foremost before starting to turn their eye towards proof of stake tokens like yourself that are really trying to address a fundamental need within the space, not necessarily looking to, you know, in terms of scalability, not necessarily looking to address, you know, taking on different fiat regimes or anything like that implicitly through Libra and even stable coins through there.
Yeah, and I mean, we're still so early. It's all the, like, I would say all those different implementations are basically experiments to figure out what works and what like regulatory zones. So I could imagine some tokens being very interesting for European regulatory makers, but horrible for Chinese policymakers, for example. And so I think it's currently there's a lot of experiments being run, and I think we will see the fruits of that pretty soon. Yeah.
Got you. I totally agree with you in that particular perspective. With that being so, sort of switching and getting back to focusing on staking facilities a little bit more, what has been the top? I know Tezos was your flagship, given, you know, everything that we talked about before, but has there been one that's most popular in terms of staking volume, maybe interest, existing customers asking about it, saying, hey, when are you going to offer this? Or just straight dollar value, the amount of money, whether in terms of euros or US dollars, that is staked within that particular asset. So what's the most popular, and what do you think the reason, or at least your anecdotal perspective as the reason behind that?
That's a really hard question.
give me bro. I
can give you. I can give you what I think is currently hot and why people think it's hot. So this is for me like the thing where we get the most like contacts right now, or people like try to contact us the most, is actually Solana. It's just because it's brand new, staking just starts. They just got listed on some exchanges, I think. So the token price is rising. And I think what people think is so interesting about it is actually we see all those like scaling solutions, and we talked about like if you're moving to ETH 2.0, which will actually use a sharding version. So basically you run a few blockchains next to each other, and they can communicate with each other, but that has some scaling issues as well and some security issues. So if every shard just has like 60 validators, then it's less secure than one chain that has like 500 validators or something like that. So I think what people think very interesting there is that Solana just has the throughput of like, I think, don't quote me on that, but it's like 50,000 transactions per second in their testnet with more than 100 validators, which basically means you don't need to shard right away. You can just run one chain with huge security and scale that way. So I think people realize that the story behind ETH 2.0 is very interesting, and if it works, there's so many like effects about the developers around it that it has the potential to work. But there's also just the chance that it doesn't work, and then we need something else. And so I think Solana is the great hedge against the risks of ETH 2.0.
Interesting. I think that's so I'm not overly familiar with Solana in and of itself, but so I think that's an interesting point that you're seeing a lot of demand come from that, both organically, meaning a fundamental premise of the network, how can its technology or technological superiority in some ways to some of the existing chains that are out there, but obviously in terms of price as well. Given, again, Tezos has been increasing in pricing. Link is by far the one that has ran the biggest this year, where a lot of people are starting to look for that next one maybe that is going to run, and I could see Solana jumping on people's radars there. But one perspective that I hadn't thought of before is people looking at these different proof of stake chains as a hedge to if Ethereum can't essentially get their act together and fix some of the patches or patch up some of the holes that they have on 1.0, or have a misstep as they translate to 2.0 as well. I think that's really interesting. I never thought of that perspective as well, or before.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that people are not considering that much right now about ETH 2.0. I mean, we now, like, I think a few days ago we had like a Reddit thread where some of the like team leaders, or I would say like the leaders of Ethereum who make the decision when we start and stuff like that, said like, yeah, it's not gonna happen this year. So it basically officially now got delayed again, which I don't mind that much. I say like, take your time, do it right. And it's always harder to transition from a running chain to a proof of stake network and just launch a new one. So that's always like, you can't compare it to Solana, which just launched a proof of stake network. And you have much more financial risk on there because like Ethereum is 100 times larger just in financial volume. So people rely on it. But yeah, I think it's interesting to hedge there, like to say like, okay, we have those different solutions. The same with like Polkadot and Cosmos, who get compared all the time. One of them says like, we need all those chains to be like secured individually, like that's Cosmos. And then there's Polkadot, which says like, we have one shared set of security, and then you just like, you concentrate on the business logic, which is like two very different concepts to achieve the same thing, which is like interchain communication. So I think hedging between those players is always interesting.
That is very, very interesting to me, and I can see that from a developer perspective, but also if you just look from like a biological perspective, and also maybe even a free market perspective as well, that's building redundancy into the system so that you don't put all the eggs, like the hopes and dreams of layer one of the web, of Web 2.0 into Ethereum, and then for whatever reason it crashes or it can never deliver on its promises, and then it's like, now what? So I think that's a really interesting sort of thought experiment in redundancy of the ecosystem in and of itself, which again kind of talks to the robustness of this particular space, albeit it is way smaller than traditional markets. But traditional markets obviously have been shown time and time again over the past 11, 12 years, they're incredibly fragile now that require constant, keeping within the hash marks to make sure that nothing detrimental is happening. With that being said, do you think, are you excited about ETH 2.0? Are your existing clients excited about ETH 2.0? Or is it just another proof of stake chain that is potentially coming online that there's been showing some demand for it that you're like, okay, we'll offer it because that's what the clients want?
And I think the interest is much higher from our side, but also from other people's perspective. From our side, it's just like looking at the market cap. If we get 1% share of that network, I mean, that would be really, really great. Like, it's just a huge opportunity for us to grow, to scale. But also from a technological perspective, having a scaled proof of stake chain with all those applications on it. How does it work? How do people use it? Will there be like those staking derivatives, and like, will staking somehow find its way into DeFi's? It's super interesting. But then also you have all those like VCs and like investment funds who bought ETH at one point, and it was a proof of work token. So you didn't have to care about governance. You didn't have to care about like all those things. And now suddenly you have to participate in those networks, or you will, as I said in the beginning, you will be diluted with your investment. And so I think that's really interesting, because suddenly all those players have to think about a strategy on chain, not just like, when will I sell this token again? When will I buy more? But more like, will I stake it? How will I stake it? Which providers will I use? Will I use my own infrastructure? What risks are there? So for example, that's one of my biggest fears with ETH 2.0 is that it will be too easy to run nodes in AWS. So that like most people will just run their nodes in AWS. And so, yeah, I mean, Ethereum has no value if it's hosted in a centralized location, in my opinion, or by a centralized entity like Amazon. So that's like, it makes it more complex, and people need to get more involved and need to think more about the things they're doing, which I think is interesting for everyone.
I agree. Again, so I'm having a great time, because that's another perspective that I hadn't thought of prior, is the fact that depending on how it's designed and everything, it can be hosted within AWS. That introduces an additional sort of exogenous threat towards this new chain, which, at least in terms of price, and I guess in terms of active addresses, has proven to be almost a non-starter within this space, and no greater example than EOS, in my particular opinion, given it's got like 21 node validators, and which is highly centralized, but done for efficiency's sake. And in terms of price, it's been fairly muted outside of the initial ICO hype whenever they sold $2 billion, of it to retail investors, and then gave a rebate to their early investors. Essentially, kind of sounds a little bit Ponzi scheme-ish, but whatever. But it hasn't moved in terms of price. And then from my understanding of the network fundamentals in terms of active addresses or just participation in general, it really hasn't gone anywhere. So again, that's an interesting thought, to where it's been shown, at least right now in this space, that's kind of a non-starter for the individuals that are building within this ecosystem, that overly centralized systems is not something that they're interested in participating in right now.
Yeah, and I mean, we're talking to some like Munich is basically like the biggest corporate like location in Germany. So like all the insurance companies are here, like the car companies like BMW are located here. And so we talked to some of them, and like most of them currently build on Hyperledger, which is like a private blockchain solution. And we always talk to them like, why don't you dare going to Ethereum? It's so huge and stuff like that. And they say like, yeah, we looked at it and it looks good, but first of all, like there's the whole smart contract getting hacked risk. We don't want to risk like not being able to reverse anything or update anything really. But what they also said is like, looking at the miners right now on Ethereum, that's a huge like no-no for them, because they say like, basically, if we launch a product that's successful, we're basically putting their hands in like 15 other companies that are smaller than us that could potentially like harm us that way. So they're really careful about that. And so telling them like, that's, for example, that's a great argument for Tezos. You have hundreds of bakers simply just because it's very Like you don't need a huge server. You could basically run a baker on a Raspberry Pi if you wanted to. But you have a lot of bakers, so there's not that much centralization around like block providers than in Ethereum right now. And that's something we need to figure out with proof of stake, if it actually helps us going more decentralized, or if it actually turns out that by like reducing, like you don't need any GPUs anymore. You don't need to run a mining farm to participate in consensus, which is great. But people need to understand that it also has impact on where people will run that hardware. It's not in a mining farm, it's probably AWS.
Got you. Again, a super interesting premise. So those individuals that you're talking to, Mercedes-Benz and other large corporations, is that within like the blockchain lab, or is it just in general that in terms of supply chain or whatever particular division is, they've already seen the value and the promise within blockchain technology and they're utilizing it already? Or is it just an experimental division, which we tend to see a lot within the US? So they're saying, you see these announcements, we're dabbling in blockchain technology or this new partnership with X company and Y corporation, but it's really dedicated labs that doesn't touch the general behemoth of the organization. It's an isolated pocket, and maybe in the future, whenever it's worked out all the bugs, they can begin to roll it out to the greater organization. So is it like that in Germany, or is where you guys are at just that far ahead in terms of, I guess, maybe mentality to innovation versus what we kind of see here in the US?
I wouldn't say we're ahead here. Like, I think, like, I mean, I can't talk about the solutions. I haven't seen, like, I'm not saying we're talking to BMW and we're having like deep discussions with them. It's just more like you meet those guys, you talk about it. Like maybe you get invited once or twice to just like explain what you're doing. But I would say overall what I've seen so far, it's mostly, as I said, private blockchains and mostly in like the proof of concept phase. And like I even talked to some people who said like, we evaluated it right now, we tried some stuff and we realized it's just not there yet. We'll try again in 5 years. So I would say they have a really realistic and careful look at it.
Got you. Makes sense, which is very endemic of corporations, which also is another reason why I love this space. It's very much scientific method iteration. It's like, all right, we'll give it a go. And if it doesn't work out, it's like, okay, well, we'll iterate and we'll make the next pivot and the next improvement. Yeah. So with that, we're running to the edge of our time limit. I want to make sure I'm respectful of your time, given how busy you are. But with that being said, I want to make sure that you talk about maybe any interesting initiatives that you guys are working on at staking facilities. So is there a new proof of stake or coin that you guys are rolling out beyond ETH 2.0, which continues to get delayed, that you're excited about? Or is there any new functionality that you guys are building in that you're looking to just get your existing clients excited about, or maybe just get people excited in general whenever they think about staking facilities?
So I think there's multiple things I could talk about. Like some are still private, like the proof of stake networks we're looking at right now. It's nothing I would announce right now.
For sure. Don't get yourself in trouble. You're hot water with your co-founders.
Yeah. No, but what I'm pretty excited about is like we're currently trying to think a lot about like what do our customers want and like how can we help them make it a smoother experience, more like you would have like in a traditional financial system. So what I'm currently spending a lot of time on is we're coding a website where you should be able to delegate your tokens to any validator you want to in the networks we support with it in the most easiest way we can see it. So we abstract away a lot of the complexity and just give you this like 5 clicks for a delegation. That's something that's really important to me because like, especially now with like the launch of Polkadot and stuff like that, like their proof of stake network is really complex and there's so many new words you would probably never have heard if you know Bitcoin and Ethereum. Like it's really, really confusing. And so we're taking away a lot of your flexibility with it, like the options you could do with staking, but we're saying like, hey, this is the easiest way to do it. If you just don't want to bother with it, just do it with us. So we're currently working on it with Polkadot, but we're also rolling it out for all other substrate chains like Kusama and Edgeware. And then we will follow up with other networks we're already like supporting, like Solana, Cosmos, Tezos. So that's something we're doing. And then I don't actually know if I'm like should talk about it because I don't like other people at staking facilities are working at it, but we're rolling out a staking academy, which is basically for us, it's just like a knowledge base for everything like proof of stake related. So the people who actually want to learn like have a starting point. So it's not like that we provide a blog with only information by staking facilities, but we will have some like guest authors who provide us some great articles. We will link existing articles to just have like one place where you can go and just see that's the new stuff. Here's an article explaining what it does and have a look. Yeah. So that's something I'm really excited about.
Well, you heard it here first, everyone. Staking Academy. So I appreciate you confiding in me and within the Crypto and Muay Thai podcast, listenership and readership as well. So that's incredibly interesting. And I can't express how much I learned in this particular conversation, but how good a time I had sort of, again, not just learning from you, but also working through some of the thought process, because like I said at the beginning of the podcast, I'm extremely interested in, I won't say bullish for a lot of the reasons that we talked about before. I think proof of stake has the ability to be something very, very pivotal within this particular ecosystem. We just need a couple more years of trial and experiment to see where it can go to maybe root out some of those unknown unknowns. But ultimately, if it can deliver in some frame or fashion, I think it is going to be an incredible mechanism or new sort of dynamic within this ecosystem. So with that, I just want to thank you, Florian, again, for taking time out of your busy workday. Obviously, you guys have tons of stuff that you're working on at staking facilities. So I appreciate you carving out time to come on the podcast. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, excellent. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning into this episode of the Crypto and Muay Thai podcast. We will see you next time, and we will 100% make sure that we have Florian on future episodes. I'll make sure that in the YouTube and the Spotify links that I include the links for staking facilities and all other potential references that we may have talked about here as well. So until next time, we'll see you again.